The sound reached me on the third-floor landing where I knelt scrubbing marble that already gleamed, a muffled sobbing that seemed to rise through the bones of Alexander Thornhill's mansion like something trapped and desperate. My hands stilled on the cloth, water dripping back into the bucket with soft, plinking sounds that suddenly seemed too loud in the vast silence. It was past midnight, and I should have been gone hours ago, back to my cramped studio apartment across the city. But I had volunteered for the late shift again because the overtime meant another week of rent, another week of invisibility, another week of safety. The crying came again, thin and broken, and my heart kicked against my ribs because I knew that sound, had made that sound myself into pillows and behind locked bathroom doors. Someone was hurting. The basement door at the end of the east corridor had been forbidden territory since my first day 6 weeks ago, when Margaret, the head housekeeper, had gripped my arm hard enough to bruise and told me in a voice like gravel that Mr. Thornhill's private areas were absolutely off-limits, that girls who got curious didn't stay employed long. I had nodded and kept my eyes down, and my questions swallowed because I needed this job too badly to risk it with curiosity. But now I was moving toward the servants' stairs, my feet carrying me down before my mind could catch up with all the reasons this was dangerous, stupid, potentially fatal. The basement corridor was colder, the air different, tasting of concrete and something metallic that coated my tongue. The door stood ajar, just 3 inches of darkness beckoning. And the crying had stopped, but I could hear something else now, a recording playing on repeat, a woman's voice pleading, my voice. My stomach dropped as I recognized the words, the specific desperate cadence from 2 months ago when I had called the police about Mark, about the bruises, about the threats. I pushed the door wider and the hinges were silent, expensive, well-maintained like everything in this mansion. The room beyond was sterile and terrible, a metal table with restraints, walls lined with soundproofing, a drain in the center of the floor, an interrogation room, a torture room. But what froze me completely was the corkboard on the far wall covered in photographs, surveillance images, all of me. Eleanor Ashford at the grocery store, Eleanor leaving her apartment, Eleanor walking to the bus stop, Eleanor sleeping in her bed, taken through her window. Weeks of watching, documenting, tracking my every movement. I heard the footstep behind me too late, felt the presence like a change in air pressure, and then his voice came, low and dark and absolutely controlled. You were never supposed to see this. I turned and Alexander Thornhill stood 3 feet away, filling the doorway with his height and breadth, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and an expression I could not read. His eyes were winter gray, sharp and assessing, moving over my face like he was cataloging my fear. I should have run, but my legs were water, my voice lost somewhere beneath the thundering of my pulse. He stepped into the room and the door clicked shut behind him with a sound like a coffin sealing. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. I was going to die here in this terrible room, surrounded by images of my own stolen life, and the realization felt cold and certain, and almost a relief, because at least the running would be over. Alexander moved closer, and I pressed back against the wall beside the corkboard, my fingers finding the cold concrete as if it could anchor me to a few more seconds of existence, and his eyes tracked the movement like a predator watching prey decide whether to bolt. You think I brought you down here to hurt you? He said, and it was not a question but a statement delivered in that low, controlled voice that seemed to resonate in my chest. I could not answer, could not force words past the terror closing my throat, and he stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the terrible patience in his expression. Mark Sutherland, he said, and my ex's name from his mouth made me flinch. Works for Richard Colborne running protection rackets on the east side, Moved up from muscle to lieutenant about 8 months ago, right around the time you left him. The specificity was a shock. The casual recitation of facts I had never spoken aloud to anyone, and Alexander gestured to the corkboard without taking his eyes from mine. You have been on Colborne's radar since March, a potential asset, leverage against me if he could figure out the connection. My mind scrambled to make sense of his words, to find the connection he claimed existed, because I was nobody, nothing, just a maid who cleaned his floors and avoided eye contact. I did not understand then, but I do now, Alexander continued, moving to the table where a laptop sat closed and expensive-looking. He opened it with economical movements and turned the screen toward me. The recording that had been playing was visualized in sound waves, my voice begging someone to please just leave me alone, and beneath it, a timestamp from 4 weeks ago. This call was made to a burner phone registered to one of Colborne's safe houses, Alexander said. Mark has been trying to find you, using his new resources, his new connections. He paused, and something flickered across his face, something almost like anger but colder. You applied to work here under a false reference that my background check should have caught, but did not, because someone in Colborne's organization helped you build a clean identity. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together. I had paid $800 to a man I met through a shelter advocate for a work history that did not include the 6-month gap when Mark had isolated me, convinced me to quit my job, made me dependent. I did not know, I whispered. Did not know it was connected to anything except survival. Alexander's expression shifted, something predatory giving way to something harder to define. I know, he said. You were trying to disappear, and you accidentally ran straight into the center of a territorial war. He closed the laptop with a soft click. I have had you under protection since the day Thomas flagged your application, full surveillance, route monitoring, apartment security upgrades you never noticed. The photographs on the wall took on new meaning, not obsession, but documentation, insurance, protection. The crying you heard was your own voice, because I was analyzing the threat patterns in Mark's attempts to locate you, he said. Colborne wants to use you to get to me, and Mark wants you back because men like him do not let go of what they consider theirs. His hands curled into fists at his sides, controlled violence contained by will alone. You cannot leave this mansion now, Eleanor. You know too much and you are too exposed. My name from his mouth was intimate and terrible. This is not a choice. The room Alexander led me to was on the 2nd floor at the end of a corridor I had cleaned a dozen times but never truly seen, and when he opened the door, I stepped into a space that mocked every conception I had of imprisonment, because this was luxury rendered as cage, all cream silk walls and furniture that probably cost more than I had earned in my entire life. He gestured to the interior with economical movement and told me I would stay here until the situation was resolved, his voice carrying that same terrible control that made me want to scream just to shatter his composure. I turned on him, and the fury came sudden and hot, burning through the fear that had kept me compliant in the basement because I had spent 8 months clawing my way toward freedom, and now I was trapped again. Protected, he called it, but a prison by any other name was still a prison. You cannot just keep me here, I said, and my voice shook, but I held his gaze. He moved further into the room and closed the door with a soft click that sounded too final. Richard Colborne controls 40% of the organized criminal operations in this city, Alexander said, and he was not looking at me but at the window where security bars were disguised as decorative ironwork. He has been trying to find a weakness in my organization for 18 months, ever since I refused to cede territory in the Port District. Your ex gave him that weakness the moment he started searching for you and connected your disappearance timeline with your employment here. I pressed my hands against my thighs to stop their trembling. So I am collateral damage in a war I did not even know existed. His head turned, and those winter-gray eyes found mine. You are a person who deserves protection, whether you understand the reasons or not. The statement was delivered like fact, like something elemental and inarguable, and I did not know how to hold the contradictions of this man who kept torture rooms and surveillance photographs and spoke of protection like it was sacred duty. Days might have passed, or only hours. I could not tell in that beautiful room with its attached bathroom and closet full of clothes in exactly my size, which meant he had been planning this contingency, had known I might need to disappear into his keeping. He visited each evening as the sun bled gold across the hardwood floors, bringing me updates delivered in that measured voice, explaining the movements of Colborne's people and Mark's increasing desperation to locate me. I should have been afraid, and I was, but something else crept in beneath the fear, as I watched him stand carefully near the door like he was afraid to come closer, as I noticed the scar across his left hand that looked old and deliberate, the kind of mark that came from a knife drawn across palm in ritual or punishment. He looked exhausted in the low light, shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleep, sacrifice to vigilance, and when I asked him why he cared so much about one random maid who had stumbled into his world by accident, he was silent for so long I thought he would not answer. Then he said simply, "Because no one protected you before." And the words landed in my chest like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward into spaces I had kept carefully empty. I saw him then, not as captor, but as something more complicated, dangerous, yes, but perhaps no more dangerous than the world that had already tried to break me. And when our eyes met across the golden distance, I felt the first treacherous flutter of something that was not fear at all. On the morning of the fourth day, I woke with resolution hardening in my chest like concrete setting around rebar, and when Alexander came to deliver his daily briefing about Colburn's movements and Mark's continued searching, I told him I would not spend another hour idle in this beautiful cage, that if I was trapped here, I would at least be useful. And the surprise that flickered across his face was almost worth the argument that followed. He said it was too dangerous, and I said I had been cleaning his mansion for 3 months without incident, and confinement was its own kind of death, the slow erasure of self that I had already survived once, and would not endure again even if he meant it as protection. And something in my voice must have convinced him, because after a long silence, where those winter eyes searched my face for cracks in my resolve, he nodded once, sharp and final. Thomas Sinclair found me that afternoon in the second-floor hallway, where I was running a dust cloth over baseboards I had cleaned 100 times before, and his presence was a wall of muscle and warning as he stopped too close, invading space with obvious intent. "You need to understand what you are to him," Thomas said without preamble, his voice low enough that the other staff moving through distant rooms could not hear. "Alexander has not taken a personal interest in anyone since his sister died, and that makes you a weapon someone will try to use." I met his gaze and refused to look away, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I did not ask for this," I said. He smiled, but it held no warmth. "None of us ask for the wars we are born into, but we fight them anyway, or we die." That evening, Alexander had a meeting in his study, and I was polishing silver in the adjacent dining room when I heard voices rise in argument. Not his, because he never raised his voice, but another man's, angry and desperate, pleading about territories and percentages and protection that was no longer guaranteed. I moved closer to the connecting door without meaning to, drawn by morbid curiosity, and through the narrow opening I saw Alexander behind his massive desk, expression carved from ice as he listened to the man beg. The answer, when it came, was quiet and absolute. "You stole from me," Alexander said. "There are consequences." I did not see what happened next, but I heard the man's cry cut short, and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. And when Alexander emerged 10 minutes later, his hands were clean and his expression was unchanged. But I saw him then as he truly was, ruthless and cold, and capable of violence I could only imagine. And when his eyes found mine across the dining room, I could not look away. He crossed to me, and I should have been afraid, but instead, I felt something complicated and dangerous unfurl in my chest, as he stopped close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something dark and expensive. "You should not have seen that," he said, and I told him I had seen worse, which was true in different ways. We stood there in the fading light, and the air felt charged like the moment before lightning strikes, and then the window behind me exploded inward in a shower of glass and gunfire. And Alexander was moving, his body slamming into mine and bearing me down to the floor as the world erupted into chaos and noise and the acrid smell of gunpowder, his weight covering me completely as he dragged us both behind the dubious shelter of the overturned dining table. "Stay down," he said against my ear, and then he was pulling a gun from somewhere and returning fire with calm precision while I pressed myself into the hardwood and tasted fear like copper on my tongue. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it started, and in the terrible silence that followed, I heard Thomas shouting orders and feet running, and Alexander was pulling me up, his hands on my arms checking for injuries with an intensity that felt like more than professional concern. "Safe room," he said. "Now." We ran through corridors I barely recognized, his hand locked around my wrist like iron, and then we were through a door disguised as a bookshelf and into a space barely larger than a closet, concrete walls and a single light, and the sound of our ragged breathing loud in the enclosed space. And when the heavy door sealed behind us with a hydraulic hiss, I realized we were alone together in the dark, closer than we had ever been, his chest against my shoulder and nowhere to go but into each other. The silence in the safe room was broken only by our breathing, and somewhere beyond the concrete walls the muffled sounds of men shouting as they swept the mansion for remaining threats. And in the dim emergency lighting, Alexander's face was all sharp angles and shadows as he finally moved back enough that I could draw a full breath. Though the space was so small, our bodies still touched at shoulder and hip. I should have felt trapped, but instead I felt something closer to safe, wrapped in concrete and darkness, with the most dangerous man I had ever known, standing between me and every threat beyond that sealed door. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his hands were still on my arms, thumbs moving in small circles that might have been unconscious comfort. I shook my head because my voice had disappeared somewhere between the gunfire and the running and this terrible intimacy of forced proximity. His jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the featureless wall as if he could see through it to whatever chaos waited outside. "This is the third attempt in 2 years," he said, and his voice carried something I had not heard before, something raw beneath the control. "Richard Colborne will keep coming until one of us is dead." I found my voice finally, scraping it up from the fear that coated my throat. "Why does he hate you so much?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and in the enclosed space I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Natalia. She was 16 when Colborne's men took her, trying to force my father into ceding territory in the Port District. My father refused to negotiate with terrorists, said it would show weakness. He believed they would not actually hurt her. The past tense landed between us like a stone, and I understood before he continued. They sent her back in pieces over the course of 3 days, he said, and his voice had gone flat and distant, like he was reciting someone else's history. My father had a heart attack when the second package arrived. I was 22 and suddenly in charge of an organization at war. I spent 18 months planning, and then I killed every single person involved in her death. Colborne's younger brother was among them. "So this is revenge," I whispered. He looked at me then, and his eyes were darker than I had ever seen them, winter gray gone to steel. "This is survival. He will not stop until I am destroyed, and everyone I care about is ashes." I felt the weight of that statement, the way it included me in the circle of people he would kill to protect, and something in my chest cracked open, because I understood then that his obsessive protection was not about control, but about a grief so enormous it had reshaped him into a weapon pointed eternally at his enemies. I told him about Mark then, about the first time he hit me, and how I believed his apologies, about the escalation over 2 years, until I was a ghost in my own life, about the night I finally ran with nothing but the clothes I wore and $200 stolen from his wallet while he slept. Alexander listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he lifted one hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and brushed his thumb across my cheekbone with such gentleness it made my breath catch. And "No one will ever touch you like that again," he said, and it was a vow and a threat and a promise all at once. The air between us felt electric, charged with everything unspoken, and when he leaned closer, I tilted my face up without thinking, drawn by gravity or madness or something I had no name for, and our lips were a breath apart when the intercom crackled to life and Thomas's voice announced all clear, the intruders neutralized, and Alexander pulled back like I had burned him. We emerged into a mansion transformed by violence, glass glittering across hardwood floors and bullet holes stitching patterns across silk wallpaper. And when Alexander looked at me in the hallway, his expression had shifted into something fierce and possessive that made my pulse skip. "Stay close to me," he said. And I knew he meant more than just tonight. And later, when I returned to my beautiful prison, I heard him in the corridor outside speaking to Thomas in a voice too low to parse words. But I caught my name, and then elimination and permanent solution, and I pressed my palm against the door, and wondered if I could love a man who killed for me, wondered if I already did. I found him in his study at dawn with blueprints spread across the desk, and a glass of scotch he had not touched. And when he looked up at my entrance, his expression shifted from surprise to something guarded and knowing, like he had been expecting this confrontation and dreading it in equal measure. "You are going to kill Mark," I said without preamble, and it was not a question. Alexander leaned back in his chair and studied me with those winter eyes that gave nothing away. "Yes," he said simply. I moved into the room and closed the door behind me because this conversation needed privacy, even though part of me wanted witnesses to whatever I was about to become. "I do not love him anymore," I said carefully, feeling my way through a moral landscape that had grown unfamiliar and treacherous. "I have not loved him for a long time, and I know what he is and what he has done. But I cannot just stand by while you execute him like this is some kind of justice." Alexander's expression hardened into something cold and pragmatic. "This is not about justice, Eleanor. This is about survival. Mark works for Colborne, and as long as he exists, he is a weapon pointed at you, and by extension, at me. He will not stop searching, and Colborne will not stop using him. The luxury of moral absolutes does not exist in my world. In our world now, whether you accept that or not." The possessive emphasis on our made something in my chest tighten, and I gripped the edge of his desk to steady myself. "There has to be another way," I said, but my voice lacked conviction because I had been in this world long enough now to understand its mathematics, the brutal calculus of threat and elimination. "What would you have me do?" Alexander asked, and he rose from his chair and came around the desk until he stood close enough that I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze. "Send him a strongly worded letter. File a restraining order. These are not tools that work against men like Colborne." I searched his face for some crack in the certainty I found there, and instead I saw exhaustion and something that looked like pain beneath the cold control. "Let me try first," I said, the idea forming even as I spoke it. "Let me make contact, draw him out, get information about Colborne's plans. If I can give you intelligence you can use, maybe that buys us another option." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, while something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "You want to use yourself as bait," he said finally, and his voice had dropped to something low and deadly. "No." The refusal was absolute, but I pressed forward anyway. "I am already bait," I said. "At least this way I have some control, some agency in what happens next. I will not be the helpless prize fought over by men who think they own me, including you." The last two words landed between us like a slap, and I saw him flinch almost imperceptibly. "I do not own you," he said quietly. "Then let me do this," I said. "Let me try." If it fails, then you do what you were planning anyway, but give me this chance to be more than a victim waiting for rescue." He turned away and braced his hands on the desk, and I watched the tension in his shoulders, the war between protection and respect playing out in the rigid line of his spine. "If I agree," he said without looking at me, "we do this my way with my people and my control over every single variable. You do not improvise. You do not take risks I have not calculated, and if at any point I determine the danger is too great, I pull you out and we go back to the original plan. Do you understand?" I moved to stand beside him, and when he turned his head, our faces were inches apart. "I understand," I said. He searched my eyes for a long moment, and then nodded once. "We start training today," he said. "If you are going to walk into danger, you will know how to fight your way out." The burner phone felt like a live grenade in my hand as I recorded the message under Alexander's watchful eyes, and I kept my voice soft and uncertain the way Mark had always preferred me, small and apologetic and desperate, saying I was sorry for leaving and I wanted to talk, and maybe we could find a way back to what we had before everything went wrong. The lies tasted like acid, but I forced them out while Alexander stood 10 feet away with his arms crossed and his jaw so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. And when I finished and lowered the phone, his eyes were winter frozen over a fury so intense it made the air feel dangerous. Thomas handled the technical side, routing the message through channels that would make it appear I was reaching out from a women's shelter in Connecticut. And we waited in Alexander's study while the hours crawled past, and I tried not to think about what I had set in motion. When the response came just after midnight, my hands were shaking so badly Alexander had to steady the phone so I could read Mark's reply, demanding I meet him at a diner on the edge of neutral territory in 48 hours, come alone or do not come at all. And the familiar controlling tone made my stomach turn even as I recognized it was exactly what we needed. Alexander spent the next 2 days transforming me into a weapon disguised as a victim, teaching me not just how to defend myself, but how to read a room for exits and threats, how to keep my breathing steady when adrenaline screamed for panic, how to fall and roll and strike at vulnerable points with enough force to buy seconds that might mean survival. In his private gym with the mats beneath us and his body pressed close to demonstrate holds and breaks, the tension between us became almost unbearable, every touch lingering a fraction too long, every instruction delivered in a voice gone rough with something that had nothing to do with the training. I felt his control fraying when I successfully broke his hold and swept his legs, landing him on his back with my hands braced on his chest and both of us breathing hard. And for a suspended moment, we stared at each other while something wild and hungry rose between us, like a living thing. But then Thomas entered to deliver updated intelligence, and Alexander was on his feet and distant again, retreating behind the walls that kept him functional and deadly. The night before the meeting, I could not sleep, and I paced my room like a caged animal until I heard the soft knock at my door just after 2 in the morning. And when I opened it, Alexander stood in the dim hallway, still dressed in the dark shirt and slacks he had worn to an earlier meeting, his tie discarded and his expression raw in a way I had never seen. "I should not be here," he said, but he made no move to leave and I stepped back to let him enter, closing the door behind him and sealing us into the quiet intimacy of lamplight and late-night honesty. The diner was all cracked vinyl and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly sick, and I sat in the corner booth Alexander had chosen for its clear sightlines to both exits, while the wire taped between my shoulder blades felt like it was burning through my skin, a constant reminder that I was being watched and protected and also terribly exposed. Mark arrived exactly on time because he had always been punctual about control. But the man who walked through the door behind him turned my blood to ice because I recognized Richard Colborne from the photographs Alexander had shown me, silver-haired and expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of power that came from decades of violence successfully executed. They slid into the booth across from me, and Mark looked older than I remembered, harder around the edges in a way that made me wonder how I had ever convinced myself his cruelty was love. But it was Colburn who spoke first with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Eleanor Ashford," he said, and my name in his mouth felt like a violation. Or should I say, Eleanor Thornhill, since that seems to be the direction things are heading. Through the earpiece, disguised as a small hearing aid, I heard Alexander's sharp intake of breath, and then Thomas murmuring something I could not quite catch. And I forced myself to smile uncertainly, like I did not understand the implications while my heart hammered against my ribs. "I do not know what you mean," I said to Colburn, and I let my voice shake because fear was easy to access when sitting across from a man who had built an empire on broken bodies. Mark reached across the table and took my hand in a grip that was just slightly too tight, possessive in a way that made my skin crawl. "You disappeared," he said, and there was accusation layered under false concern. "I have been looking everywhere, and it turns out Alexander Thornhill has been keeping you locked up like some kind of prize, but I am here now and we can fix this. We can get you somewhere safe." Colborne laughed softly, and it was a terrible sound, rich with amusement at a joke only he fully understood. "Safe is a relative term," he said, and his gaze moved over me with an assessment that was purely tactical, like he was calculating exactly how much damage my death would do to his enemy. "You see, Eleanor, I have known about Alexander's little fascination with you for quite some time now. My sources are very thorough, and I have been waiting for the right moment to leverage that weakness." Mark here thought he was looking for his lost girlfriend, but really he has been helping me set a trap, and you are the bait that will finally bring Thornhill into the open where I can end him. His hand landed on my arm above the elbow, fingers digging in with casual cruelty, and through the earpiece, I heard Alexander say my name once, low and lethal, a warning or a promise I could not quite parse. I had seconds to decide whether to run or to push forward into the danger, and I thought of everything Alexander had taught me about survival, about reading the currents of violence and finding the path through, so I leaned forward slightly and let desperation color my voice. "If you know about Alexander, then you know he will come for me," I said to Colborne. "And I am guessing you have men positioned to make sure that when he does, it is the last thing he ever does. But what I do not understand is why you are telling me this, why you are showing me the trap, unless you need something else, unless there is information you think I have." Colburn smiled wider, and I knew I had guessed right. Knew also that I had just improvised beyond the careful script Alexander and I had planned. And the static crackle of barely restrained rage in my ear told me he knew it too. Colburn was still smiling when Mark suddenly went rigid and reached toward my shoulder, where the wire pressed against my skin, his fingers finding the edge of the transmitter with the instinct of someone who had been trained to search for exactly this kind of deception. And his face transformed into something ugly with betrayal and rage as he ripped open the top buttons of my blouse to expose the device taped between my collarbones. The diner exploded into motion. Before I could draw breath to scream, Colburn's men rising from booths I had thought held only civilians, weapons appearing from beneath jackets, while the few actual customers hit the floor shrieking. And through the chaos I heard Alexander's voice in my ear saying, "Get down now." But Mark's hand was already fisted in my hair, yanking me up and back against his chest, as the front windows shattered inward under a hail of covering fire from Alexander's team positioned across the street. The world became noise and terror and the acrid smell of gunpowder, and I could not process the individual elements, only the overwhelming assault of violence unleashed in a space too small to contain it. Tables splintering under bullet impact and someone screaming, and the slick warmth of blood on the vinyl seat where Colburn had been sitting before he dove behind the counter with a speed that belied his age. Mark was dragging me backward toward the kitchen exit, his arm locked across my throat, cutting off air while he used my body as a shield, and I clawed at his forearm uselessly as black spots bloomed at the edges of my vision. But then the kitchen door exploded open, and Alexander was there with a gun raised and his face gone absolutely cold, in a way that was more terrifying than Colborne's cruelty, because this was not anger, but pure lethal calculation. Mark stopped moving, and for a heartbeat, We were frozen in a tableau of violence suspended, my ex's ragged breathing hot against my ear, and Alexander 15 feet away, utterly motionless, except for the minute adjustments of the weapon tracking for a shot he could not take without risking me. "Let her go, and you walk out of here," Alexander said, and his voice was emptied of everything except flat certainty. But we both knew he was lying. Knew that Mark was dead the moment he put hands on me, regardless of what happened in the next 30 seconds. I felt Mark's arm tighten fractionally across my windpipe, felt him preparing to refuse or negotiate or make whatever doomed choice his panic would produce. And in that suspended instant, I remembered Alexander's hands on mine in the training room, his voice patient as he showed me how to break a hold, how to use an opponent's strength against them, how to create the opening that might mean survival. I stopped fighting and let my full weight drop suddenly through Mark's grip, my knees buckling and my body going limp in a way he was not expecting, and his arm loosened for just a fraction of a second as he tried to adjust to keep me upright. But that fraction was enough for Alexander, who fired twice with precision that spoke of years honing this particular skill. Mark fell and took me down with him into a spreading pool of heat and copper smell that my mind refused to identify as blood. And then Alexander was there, hauling me up and away from the body, his hands running over me, checking for injury, while my ears rang and my mouth tried to form words that would not come. The extraction was efficient brutality, Thomas and 3 others surrounding us as Alexander carried me through the kitchen and out into the alley where black SUVs waited with engines running. And I caught a glimpse of Colborne's silver hair disappearing into a vehicle at the far end of the block, escaping while his men provided cover. But then I was being pushed into leather seats, and Alexander was beside me, and we were moving fast through streets that blurred into streaks of light as shock finally crashed over me in waves. The safe house was nothing like the mansion, just a small cottage tucked into woods so dense the moonlight barely penetrated, and Alexander carried me inside without speaking while I shook uncontrollably from shock and adrenaline crash. My hands still tacky with blood, I could not stop looking at, even though my mind refused to connect it with the reality of what had happened. He set me down on a worn sofa and disappeared into what I assumed was a bathroom, returning with a first aid kit and warm water in a metal basin. And when he knelt in front of me and began carefully cleaning the blood from my hands, his touch was so gentle, it broke something loose in my chest that came out as a sob I could not quite suppress. "You are not hurt," he said. And it was not a question but a statement he was confirming with every careful examination of my arms and face and throat where Mark's grip had left darkening bruises. And I shook my head because physically I was intact, but something else felt shattered in a way I did not have words for. I watched him. I managed to say through chattering teeth, "I watched you kill him, and I know it was necessary, and I know he would have killed me, but I cannot stop seeing it. Cannot stop feeling the exact moment his arm went slack." Alexander's hands stilled on mine, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way down to the broken foundation. And he said, "The first death you witness never leaves you. It becomes part of how you understand the world. And I am sorry you had to learn that tonight. But I am not sorry he is dead, because his existence was a threat to yours, and I will always choose you." Something in his voice made me focus, despite the shock blurring my thoughts. A thread of old pain that spoke of experience beyond tonight's violence. And I asked, "When was your first?" And he was quiet for so long I thought he would not answer. "I was 19, he finally said. And I was 6 months into medical school because I had this idea that I could save people, that I could be something other than what my family expected. But my sister got involved with one of Colborne's lieutenants, and when she tried to leave, he put her in the hospital. And the skills I was learning to heal were not enough to save her from injuries that severe." His hands resumed their work, wrapping a soft bandage around the abraded skin of my wrists with practiced precision that suddenly made terrible sense. "I found the man who hurt her," Alexander continued, "and I used everything I knew about human anatomy to make sure he suffered before he died. and my father saw what I was capable of and pulled me into the business. And I told myself I would use my knowledge to protect instead of heal since I had failed at the latter. I reached out and cupped his scarred hand in both of mine, feeling the tremor he usually controlled so carefully. "You have been protecting me from the beginning," I said, and he looked up with something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I have been falling for you since the day you started working for me," he said. "You moved through that house like you were trying not to take up space, like you were apologizing for existing, but you left kindness in your wake, fresh flowers in the library, and my coffee, exactly how I take it without being asked. And you were this bright, gentle thing in a world of violence, and I knew I should send you away before you got caught in the darkness, but I could not make myself let you go." Morning came too quickly through windows that had no curtains, pale light finding me wrapped around Alexander in the narrow bed where we had finally fallen asleep near dawn, and I felt the exact moment his body went tense with returning awareness of the threat still circling us like a wolf pack waiting for weakness. He extracted himself carefully as though trying not to wake me, but I caught his wrist and said, "You are going after Colborne today." And it was not a question because I could read the decision in every line of his body, already braced for violence. Alexander turned back with his face settling into that remote mask he wore when preparing for blood, and he said, "He escaped last night, and that cannot stand. If I do not end this now, he will keep coming for you, and I will not live with that possibility." I sat up, clutching the sheet to my chest, and said, "Then I am coming with you," and watched his expression shift from shuddered to outright refusal before I even finished speaking. "You will stay here where it is safe," he said with the tone that expected obedience, but I had not survived everything in the last weeks to be locked away like something fragile while he walked into danger that existed because of me. I stood and faced him, still wearing his shirt from the night before, and said, "I will not hide in a cottage while you risk your life. I will not be the person who lets others fight my battles anymore." And the conflict that crossed his face was visible proof that he understood even as he hated it. The argument stretched between us sharp and desperate, until Thomas called with an update that forced a compromise I knew Alexander despised. I would stay with the secondary team at a secure location, while he and his most trusted men went directly for Colborne's stronghold in an industrial zone near the docks. The drive back toward the city was tense and silent, Alexander's hand gripping mine with barely controlled intensity, while his other hand checked weapons with the automatic precision of long practice. And when we reached the staging point, and he had to leave me with Thomas and 4 others in a warehouse that smelled of oil and rust, I saw something like fear in his eyes for the first time. "Come back to me," I said, and he kissed me hard and promising, before walking away into the gray morning light. And I forced myself not to watch him disappear because I needed to believe I would see him again. The warehouse was cold and time moved like honey, Thomas monitoring radio chatter that came in bursts of coded language I could not fully parse. And I paced the concrete floor, imagining 100 different disasters, until Margaret appeared in the doorway carrying a thermos and wearing her usual severe expression that had always seemed merely stern, but now struck me as something else entirely. Thomas stood automatically, some instinct making him reach for his weapon, but Margaret was already moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman her age, and the small pistol in her hand fired once with a crack that echoed off metal walls before Thomas went down, clutching his shoulder. I froze for one precious second, while my mind tried to reconcile the familiar housekeeper with the woman now turning the gun toward me with eyes gone flat and mercenary, and she said, "Colborne pays better than Thornhill ever did, and you should have stayed a frightened little maid instead of playing at being a queen." She fired, and I threw myself sideways behind a stack of pallets, splinters exploding near my head, and everything Alexander had taught me came flooding back through the panic as I scrambled for Thomas's fallen weapon, while Margaret advanced with the patient certainty of someone who had done this before. My fingers closed around Thomas's weapon just as Margaret fired again, and the bullet tore through my side with a sensation like being branded, white-hot and disorienting. but I rolled behind a metal support column and came up with the gun raised the way Alexander had shown me, breathing through the pain that threatened to drag me under. Margaret was advancing with the calm certainty of someone who had killed before, her familiar face twisted into something mercenary and cold, and she said, "You should have stayed invisible, Eleanor, but you had to make Alexander Thornhill care about you, and now Colburn will use your corpse to break him." I fired and missed, the recoil jarring my wounded side, but it made her dive for cover and bought me seconds to scramble toward the warehouse office, where I could hear Thomas groaning and trying to reach his radio. The next minutes were a blur of survival instinct and terror, Margaret hunting me through the maze of equipment while I left a trail of blood that made concealment impossible, and I knew I was losing this fight as darkness crept into the edges of my vision. Then the warehouse doors exploded inward, and Alexander was there with murder in his eyes, taking in the scene with a single sweep before his gun spoke twice, and Margaret went down without ceremony. And the last thing I saw before my legs gave out was his face draining of color as he caught me. I woke in a private hospital room with Alexander sitting beside my bed, his hand wrapped around mine, and his head bowed in an attitude that looked almost like prayer. And when he sensed me stirring, his head snapped up with eyes red-rimmed and wild, in a way I had never seen. "You stopped breathing in the ambulance," he said, his voice wrecked and raw. "And I had to watch them restart your heart while being unable to do anything, because my hands were covered in Colborne's blood, and I could not be the one to save you." I squeezed his hand weakly and said, "But I am here," and he made a sound between a laugh and a sob before kissing my knuckles with a reverence that felt like a vow. "Colburn is dead," he said, "and Margaret died in the warehouse, and the threat is ended, but I cannot do this anymore, cannot send you into danger, or keep you in a world where housekeepers turn assassin, and every day might be the one where I lose you." He took a shaking breath and said, "I am giving you a choice, Eleanor, a real one this time. I can set you up somewhere safe far from this city with a new identity and enough money to build whatever life you want. Or you can stay with me fully aware that my world will always carry danger and that I am asking you to walk into it with eyes open as my partner in every sense." I looked at this man who had protected me and challenged me and loved me past his own capacity for fear, and I said, "I choose you, Alexander. I choose this life and the danger it brings, because I would rather face it at your side than spend another day trying to be invisible and small." 3 months later, I stood in the mansion library wearing silk instead of an apron, learning the intricacies of his business with the same attention I had once given to cleaning schedules. And when Alexander came to find me